The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor. I'm from stemCONNECT. Thank you for joining us today for the STEM of Archaeology session that we have with Emma Dietrich. For questions, please put them into the question box. We'll try to get all of your questions answered through the session. If there's any difficulties with your audio, webcam, or microphone, please let me know, and I'll be sure to assist you in the chat. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to Emma to share their presentation, introduce themselves.
All right, perfect, guys. It's nice to virtually meet all of you. So my name is Emma Dietrich. I am an archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. I'm an informal lecturer, so we can chat some more at the end. I'll get to my presentation specifically about archaeology and digital heritage. And I will share my screen here and we'll get the ball going. All right. Let's hope everyone can see this. So again, I'm Emma with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. I am an archaeologist who specializes in public engagement. So talking about Florida's buried and submerged past, but also specialize in 3D digital heritage, or more specifically, photogrammetry. So to get off our conversation to a start, we really want to talk about what is archaeology. So this is kind of meant to be a little bit more engaging, but since we're virtual, we're just going to run through it all together. So if one of the first things that you thought of was rocks, I have to inform you that no, archaeology does not study rocks. That would be the science of geology. If your next thought was dinosaurs, I hate to disappoint you, but archaeologists do not study dinosaurs. That is the field of paleontology. And if the last thing you thought of was treasure hunting, like gold and silver and jewels, and you get an image of Indiana Jones in your mind, unfortunately, that is not the case. That is just classically what we call treasure hunting. So if that's the case, what really is archaeology? Archaeology is the study of past people through the material remains that they leave behind. So material remains are anything from our day-to-day trash, things intentionally left behind, historic structures, and in this case, like we have historic cannons that were obviously left behind, pottery shards from broken dishes and things, even down to well structures or things that are built into the landscape. So archaeology is a subfield of a overarching discipline called anthropology. Anthropology is the study of human beings and their ancestors, and it's kind of divided into 4 subfields. You have cultural anthropology, which is a study of people's cultures, both in the present and the past. We have biological anthropology, which is the study of the human being or the human body, mostly through its physical remains. So skeletal system, our evolution, and things like that is how we come to be. I have a colleague who's a biological anthropologist, and she can look at a skeleton and figure out when you broke your arm when you were a kid ball skateboarding. She can see all those stressors in the bones themselves to understand how people were living. We joke a lot in archaeology that the biggest change that we're going to see in the future is arthritis in our thumbs from cell phone use. We're using our thumbs a lot more than our ancestors, so we'll start to see that impact on the bone. Linguistic anthropology is the study of the languages and cultural dialects that people speak. I'm originally from up north, so my go-to would not be y'all, it would be yous. And so it's kind of that study of how those regional differences are, but also languages as a whole. And then we get to archaeology, which is the study of the human past through the material culture, the material things that are left behind. So when I talk about those things that are left behind, what exactly is that? We call it an artifact. And an artifact is anything that is made or used by humans. We can talk about things like dugout canoes, pottery, cannons, bottles, stone tools. A lot of people think about archaeology as arrowheads, and that is because they were made or used by people in the past. And the stuff is really neat, but archaeology isn't necessarily about the actual things. It's about the people as a whole, and it's about how these things were used in the past. So it's kind of like a puzzle where we have a whole bunch of different puzzle pieces, but without the actual box or all the associated puzzle pieces, we're not really going to understand what the story of the past is. So all of these small artifacts, these physical remains of the past, come together to tell us that story about human conditions and human existence in the past. So when we talk about the fact that the artifacts, it's not about the artifacts, it's about the people, we really want to emphasize the fact that we are a subfield of anthropology. So we really are looking to understand how people were engaging in the past through the things that they were using on a day-to-day basis. And it helps us round out the story of what is Florida, or honestly, what is our human past. So we talk about the archaeological process. So archaeology is a science. I'll get into a little bit more about that, but we do follow the scientific method. So in our ways of doing our archaeological process, we need to first locate a potential site that we want to do. We go through the actual excavation phase, which will be the physical digging, which a lot of people think of archaeology as. But for every month spent in the field, we have to spend another 3 months in the lab working on the materials and understanding what we were really seeing in the ground. We go through artifact identification and examination. The artifacts will help us give us information like date, the groups of people who are living in an area, or other information. And we compile all of our lab analysis, and we begin to start to interpret about what is happening on this site. And then those artifacts and those materials will go through preservation processes. And then our last step and our goal of most sciences or all science is to disseminate that knowledge, to share that information with the public and other researchers. And so when you see things that are in a museum exhibit, especially those materials, what we end up seeing are only one small part of that archaeological process. There's so much that's behind the scenes that has happened to get that artifact from its site to the public presentation. So when I talk about archaeology as a science, it is in what we call a destructive science. Most of the time when you follow the scientific method, the goal is to be able to replicate this work. But since we're working in environments that are not able to be replicated in a lab, we're never going to have another one of these sites. We are actively destroying our sites and our information as we go. So when we talk about this destructive science, the best idea is if you dig a hole in the beach, are you able to put every single seashell back in that hole as it came out, each layer and level to its accuracy? And most of the time, it's no, you can't do that. So archaeologists take an aggressive amount of notes and documentation to really record what's happening on the site. Talked about the physical artifacts, but not all artifacts are physical. They're not things that we can take out of a site. That center photo is of a wall of a historic fort that would have been in the ground, but you can see where the wood has disintegrated and left this stain. They're what we would call features, and they're non-movable artifacts that tell us part of the story of the past. So all of these different methods that come into play when it comes to site excavation are all going to be adapted to each specific site. But the most important part is having the intense levels of documentation. So we're able to learn more about our site after we have actively destroyed it. So with a destructive science, documentation is critical. Maps, line drawings, photographs, detailed excavation notes, all of this information is what our data is. It's all of our documentation of the sites as things get destroyed. And the reason why documentation is critical is because for archaeology, context is key. It's not about the object, it's about what the object can tell us in relationship to things, relationship to the site, and to relationship to the overall history that's occurring. So we have two images here, and both are related to firearms. We have a series of stone flints. So these have been for a flintlock rifle, and the kind of dragon dog metal motif is an object that is used on decorative gun hardware. So when we see things like this, it's kind of obvious that we can interpret that someone on the site that we're working on had access to firearms. And when we place this in context, the greater context, we know that this material came from an enslaved cabin at the site of Kingsley Plantation, which is north of Jacksonville, Florida. And so when we're starting to study this in context, we're able to understand the fact that there were armed enslaved peoples living on this site, which tells us a little bit more about what life was like for these enslaved Africans at the time. That they had a little bit more freedoms within the Spanish Florida system of slavery rather than that of what would become the American system. And I can talk more about that if folks have questions. But it's really about this context. We need to have this heavy level of documentation so we're able to make these connections. So with archaeology, you really want to find the right tool for the job. And this could be, depending on your site, it could be digging, it could be a shovel, it could be a scuba tank. We do have underwater archaeology. It could be brushes, but more specifically, it could be 3D technology. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about specifically with our STEM and archaeology talk was the process of photogrammetry. So photogrammetry is a way to make 3D models of artifacts or really anything. And the process is that you take photos in a mathematical sense to be able to reconstruct the artifact in 3D and in the virtual world. And so, like I said, we do this by taking a series of high resolution photographs at varying degrees. So you ultimately capture 360 degrees, all the sides and angles of an object. And then you're able to look for what is known as the stereoscopic view, which is the amount of overlap that occurs. And our computer systems are able to create that 3D model. So when we talk about what we're doing is we're able to preserve these materials in the archaeological, these materials from the archaeological record in the digital world. So we're able to not only share this information with the general public, we're also able to share this with researchers around the globe. It's a lot easier to share digital files than being able to share the physical object. So the little spinning vessel that just occurred is a Point Washington incised pot that was reconstructed. It comes from our Mississippian era, which is about 1,000 years ago to about the point of European colonization and contact around the year 1500. And so this material is currently on display in Pensacola, Florida, but virtually we're able to bring it and use it in presentations. So other ways that we're able to document our sites our digital heritage sites, we don't necessarily need to focus on small artifacts. We're also able to focus on large landscapes. So we can do photogrammetry through aerial drone photography. We're able to capture that data to get large sites. We're also able to do the process of laser scanning. So laser scanning would be akin to photogrammetry, but in the sense that we do use high resolution a laser system to map out the shape of an object and are able to reconstruct it using, again, our computer software. We can do this on the small scale, but we're also able to do this in the larger sense. So at the Florida Public Archaeology Network, we're actively and continuously scanning archaeological sites that are at threat from climate change. So we're seeing active and heavy erosion at these sites. And so we're out collecting data without ever needing to excavate because these sites are being washed away and we can track the changes over time. From our, that got a little bit moved around, but from these artifacts, what's really great is the fact that we're able to then 3D replicate these. We can 3D print these that can go into museum exhibits, that can be tactile experiences for folks going to exhibit spaces or going to schools. We're able to make these artifacts a little bit more stable so the public can enjoy them at a larger scale. And so that is kind of a really rough ending. But what I like to always say is I am an informal lecturer, so I really appreciate giving a good introduction to what I want to talk about, but then really make this more personalized to the students or whoever's in on my talk right now. So I'm available if anyone has any sort of questions or wants to follow up or wants to know about how you can learn more about photogrammetry or digital heritage. I am here for anything.
Awesome. And we do have a few questions that have come in. The first one
Awesome.
being, did you go to school for archaeology?
Yes. So I went to a lot of school, a lot of schooling. So I did 4 years of my undergraduate work in anthropology, concentrating in archaeology and sociocultural anthropology. And I went to the Mercyhurst University in Pennsylvania. And from that 4 year degree, I went on to get a master's degree. And I went to the University of West Florida, concentrating in historical archaeology and public engagement. And so in the world of archaeology, is required to have a 4 year degree to be able to practice any standard work, or what we like to call in the field shovel bumming, where you are doing the field manual labor. To be able to lead excavations or become more of that researcher status, you are required to have a master's degree. It's something called Secretary of the Interior Standards, and that's a government regulation that requires someone who's leading a project to have a master's degree. And so I do have my master's, and that took about 5 years. So I would say I've been in 9 years of school, but that does not include what we call field school, which is another requirement. There's a lot of school involved. There's a lot to learn to be able to dig a really good hole. But a field school is where you spend a summer learning the methods of how to excavate properly and how to document these sites in the field.
Awesome. And another question that we have here is, how did you decide to go into this field?
Oh, that's my favorite story. I've been in the profession for quite a while, and we always have these conversations about what got you into archaeology, because it is a weird kind of field. It's not what you often see folks going into. And there's really two tracks of folks who got into archaeology. One is either they took a class in college and really liked it and decided to follow it all the way through, change their plans, and become an archaeologist. Or like myself, I visited a historic site as a child and immediately got hooked. I visited a site called Historic St. Mary's City in Southern Maryland when I was about 5 years old, maybe even a little bit younger, and was so enthralled with the idea that you could dig in your backyard and you can find history. And they had an active dig going on, and a field school student, which probably broke some OSHA regulations, but I'm going to assume it was, a long time ago, picked me up and put me into a unit and allowed me to brush off some material, and I got hooked. And so I just wanted to be able to include all of my passions, which was being outdoors, learning about history, and honestly getting a little dirty, being able to physically get my hands on things rather than doing physical research in a library or doing text-based research.
Oh, that's awesome, especially finding that so young.
Oh yeah, I was hooked. I knew it. I will say archaeology is not a cheap career to get into, especially when it comes down to the extended levels of school that is required. So it was definitely it's a passion position. It's not something you go into thinking you can, make a good salary. It definitely requires some student loan debt and a bit of not the highest pay, but you're happy going to work every day.
Right, exactly. Another question that we have, what is the coolest artifact that you found?
Oh, I knew this was going to happen. So I have two stories that I like to tell for my favorite artifact I ever found. And so the first one, the favorite artifact I ever found was a nail, like a hammer and nail, not like a fingernail. But so the nail specifically, I was working in a 1850s fort in Taos, New Mexico, and we were doing our excavations. And so this is a machine cut nail, and it was oddly split. So if you imagine a nail, how it has one head and one point, instead this time the head was split, but the point was still intact. And we thought that was really weird. So on site, we're kind of thinking about what this nail meant, why we only found one. And our ultimate conclusion was that there was something wrong with the metal, that since it spent, over 150 years in the ground, the metal must have corroded and it just started to split apart, or something weird is happening. And so I go leave the field, go back home, and like showing off photos to my family. And I showed the photo of the nail. It's like, oh, we found this really weird nail and really kind of cool. And I skipped over it. And my uncle's like, why do you think that nail's weird? And I was like, well, the metal's corroded, so it must have been like a cheaper material. And, you know, thinking about all these ideas about why this nail was weird. And he's like, no, it's a specific furniture nail that you could tap in part way and then wedge apart the wood for like a decorative finish for furniture. I had absolutely no idea. Neither did my boss, who had been in archaeology for over 50 years. But it kind of shows that us as humans, we don't necessarily change all that much. And that our history is so recent that things from 150 years ago, 200 years ago are still being used to this day. And it's just how we have that specialized knowledge as people. So I always love that specific artifact. But another artifact that I say we, because it's not an artifact that I found, but my coworker got to work on one of those non-movable artifacts, those features in the ground. And what it was is what is affectionately called a fish pit. And it was layers upon layers upon layers of fish scales, where someone had sat and caught a bunch of mullet and proceeded to prep all of the fish, probably for smoking. And that trash refuse pile was just layer cakes of fish scales, about yay deep and about yay wide. And so it was really cool to kind of see that, and you start to imagine the person who is processing this material and discarding that waste intentionally. Not the coolest thing to excavate, a little bit complicated because they're fish scales. Most of it actually did get collected to go back to the lab so we can figure out exactly what type of fish that was here at that time period. So there's two.
Awesome, awesome. And then another question that we have here is, can your job be dangerous?
Yes. There are many risks that are involved with archaeology. I would say specifically, I currently have a 9mm hole torn in my tendon in my ankle from doing field work. So you're working outside. And so you have all of the risks of being outdoors doing this type of labor. So not only are you using, hand tools that tend to be sharp, but you're normally you're in remote areas. So everything from ticks to snakes to alligators to mountain lions, bears, hogs, anything that you're going to experience while out hiking is things that we're experiencing in the field. So ultimately, one of our biggest threats is ticks, just because of the amount of tick-borne illnesses that exist. And with the climate crisis, the ticks that do carry those diseases are actually becoming more prevalent. So we're starting to see an increase in coworkers who have tick-borne illnesses. But it's a dangerous career because, again, we're working outside. So we need to take into consideration our water consumption, heat, sunburn, all of that information comes into, or all of that outdoor work tends to impact us. I think our biggest threat really is not being adequately prepared for any scenario. So we do go through a lot of safety trainings. I'm a scuba diver as well as an archaeologist. So we do go through how to supply people with oxygen if we're on a boat, how to properly transport people, general CPR, we get that up to date almost every year. So we're able to provide aid in the field. So there is some danger, definitely a little bit more, I guess it's the more moving parts there's uncontrollables, I would say that, when it comes to working in the field.
Absolutely. And I hope you're okay.
Oh yeah, I'll get surgery here in a little bit. It'll be good.
Okay. And we have a follow-up question. Do you also travel to other countries for discoveries?
So I don't travel internationally. I have colleagues who do. Oh, actually, I just lied. I did just travel internationally to do some work. But my training specifically is more geared towards American archaeology, so that it tends to be where I stay. I've done work all over the country, from Nebraska to New Mexico to Pennsylvania to Virginia to Florida, all over the continental United States. But I just lied and said I don't do work internationally, but I did just travel to Scotland, and we did some recording of what's called a ship graveyard, which is where ships are pulled up to the shoreline and basically left to disintegrate. They're no longer needed, so they're moored up. They're not necessarily shipwrecks, they're just ships that have fallen apart where they sit. So we were recording a series of boats that are from about 1910, just about around the outbreak of World War I. So I did do a little archaeology internationally, but I also have colleagues who travel all but every other month to go to sites across the world, specifically folks who are working in digital heritage. They're traveling to do 3D modeling of sites and at-risk sites around the world.
Okay, awesome. And we're coming up to our time here, so we'll just do the last couple of questions. One is asking, how is a fossil different from an artifact?
Oh, so a fossil is different from the artifact based on the idea on if it was made or used by humans. So artifacts are objects that are made and used by humans. So there is a little bit of a blur line in the case where if someone had that fossil, like I have a fossil on my shelf, so technically at some point its context would tell me it's an artifact rather than just a fossil. But fossils tend to exist before we have human activity. So that just tends to be that little divide. But artifacts, again, just made or used by humans. It could be everything from a stone tool to honestly, to a cell phone. At some point, we'll have our cell phones be considered archaeological.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, and then for our last question, we have, when you dig up artifacts, where does it go afterwards?
So this is a good question. So the first step after an artifact is excavated is that it gets sent to a research lab. And so it depends on who you're doing your project through. So in this case, I do a lot of my work through Flagler College. And so it goes to the Flagler College Archaeological Center. And that's where it goes through the process of rough sorting, cleaning, organizing, and identification. And so that process that artifact goes through is excavation, then to the lab. If it needs to be properly conserved, so it's stable, so like rusted objects, different types of metal, wood, will go through another chemical process by a conservator who will make sure that that artifact is able to be stable for generations to come. After that initial cleaning process, it gets stored normally at the research center until they're able to go back through and really work on the interpretations. And then usually those better pieces that kind of highlight the interpretation of the story will then get either documented through me, like 3D, or we'll end up in the museum exhibit talking about the history and the site. Not every artifact gets put on public display. So there is long-term curational facilities. So the state of Florida, for any sort of archaeology done on state lands or through state projects, has a very large archaeological collection in Tallahassee. Most universities also have collections that they have an archaeology department. And the Tallahassee office does allow for site visitation. You can go out to their curational facilities and really tour through some of the collections. The reason why collections end up in curation is because we'll work on a site and we'll keep everything. And so if we're working in a historic house site, then that house burned down. Imagine every single nail or screw that was used to construct your home, and imagine that being in the ground. So I've worked on sites that have 80,000 nails, and so that material gets kept in storage. No one really wants to go and see a pile of 80,000 rusted nails, but I do want to see the objects that are a little bit more personable that we can relate to, or that help us tell the story of the history that's happening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma, for a great presentation. And thank you to everybody that joined today and asked great questions. Please visit our website for upcoming sessions that we have coming up and for requesting another session. Thank you again, Emma. That was amazing.
Perfect. Thank you. And I also just
Yes.
I was going to plug, if anyone's interested in archaeology, we have our website, which is fpan.us, so FPAN.US. You can get some more information about Florida's archaeology, get in contact with other archaeologists, including myself, if you had a question. we're here.
Awesome, perfect. And I'll be sending that link into the follow-up emails to us as well, so we can have that. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have a great
all.
day. Yes.
Thanks. You as well. Bye.
Bye-bye.